Welcome to Podcast Bridging Voices, the podcast series of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Multinational Development Policy Dialogue in Brussels. With podcasts, we connect international experts and voices from the global south with policy and decision makers in Europe.
Welcome to our Future of Democracy dialogue. My name is Dennis Schrey. I am the program director of the Multinational Development Policy Dialogue of Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Brussels. The main aim of this series is to discuss current global trends of democratic development. In our dialogue today, we will focus on political parties, their role, performance, and organization from a global perspective. For this discussion today, we did invite Willi Hofmeister, the author of the recently published book on political parties shape democracy. Willi, very nice to have you here in our studio in Brussels.
Thank you, Dennis, for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Dear Willi, could you please introduce yourself to our audience and give us a reflection on what has been your main motivation to publish the book at this moment of time?
Well, I have roughly 35 years worked for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in different countries, and I have mainly worked together with political parties. Our aim was to promote political parties and to strengthen political parties. I did a lot of political education with young party members, with youngsters from social organizations, and I did see that the knowledge and the information about political parties is not so profound in many countries because there is no political education, because the parties themselves do not care so much about political training with their youngsters. And so I sat down and did write a book on political parties to explain what political parties are, why we need political parties, why political parties are so essential for representative democracy. And the aim of my book is also to inform members of political parties about different aspects of the life of political parties, because the party members, also party leaders, have to be aware what it is, why parties exist, and what parties can do to strengthen their democracies.
Yes, Willi. Political parties, as you said in your book, are the link between society and the state. For our audience here, we would like to give a bit more on background on political parties and their role. You mentioned in your book that political parties are the link between state and society. So could you give a short explanation why political parties have to exist and why we cannot live without them in a representative democracy?
Political parties simply exist because there is a variety of opinion about nearly any case of public concern. And political parties represent the different aspects, a different way to see certain social developments or social challenges or political challenges for a country. Parties are based on ideologies, and on this they have different points of view. And so parties represent the different opinions, and they have to contribute to bring different ways of opinion together to a kind of a common decision-making process in a society. And that's why political parties exist. Countries without variety of political parties cannot be democratic. So there is no common or unique opinion in any society.
Thank you, Willi. What we can observe in many countries is that there is a trust lack in political parties due to a number of frustrations of the general public in the political representation. Political representation is often perceived as disconnected from the realities of ordinary people. There seems to be a rising gap which leads to an increased abstention in elections and also a general feeling that politicians do not really represent the ordinary people and the public interest. Would you observe a similar development at the moment?
Yes, of course. There is a lack of trust, as you mentioned, in political parties everywhere. We can see this in Europe. We see this also in many other countries and continents, that the parties did lose trust and confidence in societies, and this, of course, will weaken democracies. This loss of trust has different reasons. One is the fragmentation of our modern societies. This contributes also to the fragmentation of political party systems and difficulties to come together to find compromises and consensus on certain questions. We can observe that the number of people who want to engage in political parties is decreasing, and on the other side we see an increase of political parties. So there are a lot of new political parties, but all these parties do not have the possibility to gain broader support or majorities, and this will weaken even more the traditional or the existing political parties. Fragmentation of our society is a serious problem and is also expressed in the area of political parties, that we do not have these social cleavages anymore, which in earlier times contributed to building of political parties and also to bring certain social groups to political parties, link certain social groups with political parties. This missing link now is of course weakening the capacity of political parties to represent society, and therefore we have in many democracies we have a serious problem of representation.
Thank you, Willi. So you described a little bit the systemic challenges of political parties. When you look at the recent histories and corruption scandals, now yesterday Boris Johnson had to step back as well. Would you see also that there is internal challenges in political parties to be transparent and integer? So is it not also a little bit the fault of political parties themselves that they lose trust by citizens?
It's not only a little bit. I think there's a lot of problems of the parties themselves, and therefore also I try in my book to contribute a little bit to strengthen the need to adjust political organization, also party organization, the need to elaborate better political programs, and of course also the need to educate political leaders. A serious problem in our days is weak leadership or political leaders who are not able to behave in a proper way with regard to the actual problems of our societies or of the international society. Developments in Great Britain or in the United States, the oldest modern democracies, show that these countries are not able to bring ahead leaders who are really able to defend the values of democracy, who know about the procedures of democracy. If you have a president of a country who does not know certain aspects of the constitution of its countries and of the procedure of parliaments and political organizations, this is a serious problem. But also the political parties must be aware of the need to reorganize or to restructure their organization, to adjust their organization to new challenges. What about digitalization, for instance? This is a challenge not only for proper administration in inner party affairs, but also this is a possibility to bring new people together with political parties, or to outreach to other groups. But these technical instruments are not used yet in a proper way. We have to think about election of leaders within political parties. Forms we select our leaders, the forms we select candidates. And of course, we have to think about how to bring women into leadership position within political parties. These are organizational questions. Parties did not, or many parties do not reply in a proper way until now.
You did work for more than 2 decades with political parties and especially young politicians and young leaders in Latin America, in Asia and in Europe. What are the main takeaways from those experiences, and where do you see the main differences between political parties in Europe, Latin America and Asia?
In Europe, we fortunately have a more consolidated democratic environment. We have a more consolidated democratic tradition, and we have a little bit more political education. In some countries in Europe, I see we have quite intensive efforts beginning from schools and public institutions as well as by private institutions to educate young people. In many other countries, also in Europe, in some countries, we do not have similar efforts of political education. And I think it's empirically proven that countries with a better level of political education will have stronger democracies and stronger democratic institutions. This means also stronger political parties. I see really hungry young people to get more information about political party, to engage in political parties. Young people can also be very quickly be frustrated. They see how elder leaders behave, how things are going on. And young people sometimes are also frustrated because they don't know how about the procedures of democracy. For instance, young people do not like compromise so much, or coming to a consensus on certain issues. But this is also part of democracy. So we have to learn to be tolerant, to listen to others, and to find solutions which will also consider the interests of other social groups. And this has to be learned. And I think this is an advantage still of European democracies. Also, in Europe, it's becoming more and more difficult. So I see a lot of will, of interest to engage in politics by young people, but also a lot of frustration because many political parties are not able to integrate the youngsters and to promote youngsters in their rank and file.
Willi, you have touched in your book a lot about leadership and political leadership. You spoke about the personalization of political competition and the presidentialization of political parties. Could you explain us the advantages and disadvantages of such phenomena?
Well, in political science, is a lot of writing in the last years about the personalization of politics and of political parties. I'm not so convinced about that it is a new phenomenon, because politics was always driven by strong leaders, and political parties always needed and need a strong leader. So I think this is not so new. Maybe the new aspect is that many of the party leaders even try to differentiate between themselves as a person and their political parties. So sometimes we see campaigns, not only in presidential elections, but also in parliamentary elections, where the symbols of political parties are not shown anymore or do not appear, but only the individual leader. And this is of course a problem if leaders try to disconnect from their institution or from their organization. Because without an organization, without the political parties, most of the leaders will not be able to win an election or even to govern. Because one thing is winning an election and the other is to have a strong government. And for a strong government in democracy, you need also the support of a parliament, and the parliaments are normally composed by political parties. So political parties are essential also when an individual leader will think he does not need a party organization. So it is problematic if the leaders do not show their partisanship, their relation to political parties, but without parties, strong leaders cannot survive.
You mentioned the importance of having strong party institutions and organizations. When you worked in different countries, could you see some differences between the level of institutionalization of political parties, and how would you assess those?
Of course, there is a level in the sense, a difference in the sense of political parties. In the traditional and older democracies, there's much more agreement that parties are needed, although they are heavily criticized, but anybody will agree that there's a need of political parties. In the such-called younger democracies, there is not yet the tradition. We have also other traditional institutions, formal institutions, of informal institutions. We have strong families in many countries. We have the military sector, we have the business sector. All these sectors influence heavily on politics, and so political parties, especially when they do not have a real link to certain social groups, continue to be very weak. In some countries we have not a sense of opposition, so opposition is not really accepted, and this is a cultural phenomenon in a part, but it's also a problem which contributes to weaken political parties. And I come back to political education, where schools and media do not care about political education of the people. Then people are lost, and political parties are also lost, and political parties do not invest so much in strengthening their organization, but only are concentrated on the leader. Organization need, for instance, that parties try to be present not only at the national level, but also in the municipal level, in the villages, in the counties, and so on. This is still lagging behind in many new democracies.
You now mentioned that we need a combination of good, integer political leaders, strong institutions. When you look at the political landscape across the globe and it comes to characterizing what is a political leader, could you maybe mention some key elements, some key characteristics of what a good political leader is for you?
Political leader, he should have different capacities. Of course, he must have the capacity to speak, to have some charisma. He must be able to think strategically. He must have knowledge about political issues. Yeah, he should have knowledge about political issues. He should have a strong character. He should be able to motivate people. But, and I think what is also heavily needed all over the place is an ethical attitude or an ethical behavior, some ethical guidelines which a leader must have and must show when he takes decision, because the decision of a political leader do not only affect himself and his family, but the whole country. And therefore, leaders, of course, must show ethical value-oriented attitudes which are above the average. And unfortunately, we must see that in many cases, many leaders nowadays do not comply with these necessities or characteristics.
We could also observe that in many countries, politics is dominated also by male or by men. To come back to the question of how to ensure that representation in political parties is balanced, we are, I think, in many societies far away from that. What kind of mechanisms you think political parties or representative democracies have to establish to ensure a stronger participation of women, not only in the democratic process, but also in give them access to leadership position, for example?
I think this is a very serious problem nowadays, because all over the place in many countries women want to participate more actively in politics, and they need to be in politics. It is of course sometimes difficult because of the electoral laws to offer women possibility to enter parliaments, but it is proven empirically that when parties open up their leadership positions to women, then we will have more women also as candidates for parliamentary or other political positions. And I think for political parties, it should be, and it is in fact easy, to bring more women in leadership positions. So they must introduce some kind of internal quota system or other procedures which will guarantee easily. And this can be decided by the political parties alone. The electoral questions regarding the electoral system is a little bit more difficult in some countries, because this cannot be decided by a party alone. But all happens within a political party is normally decided by political parties. And parties can do a lot. And of course, if parties agree, they can also change the rules. For instance, party laws or party regulations can force a certain kind of quota, so that every second or 50% of party leadership positions may be filled up by women, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of possibilities, and we can also look to a lot of countries where they have certain rules. In Spain, in France, in the Nordic countries, they have some very good regulations which at the end of the day guarantee that we have around about 45 to 50% of women in parliaments and in important government positions.
When we look a little bit beyond representation of women, of youth in political parties, look at the question of communication. We have sometimes the feeling that political leaders or parties, the time of Twitter and of YouTube, communicate 24 hours per day, or want to gather with the electorate on a day, or let's say on a minute-by-minute basis. So my question is, how do you see these developments of constant communication between politicians and the electorate? Is this healthy for the democratic process, or do you also see some challenges?
Well, of course, there's a lot of challenges with regard to modern ways of communication. And I think both sides, politicians, but also the citizens, are in a certain way cheated by this kind of new forms of communication, because many citizens think they do not need political parties anymore, because they have a kind of a direct form of communication with politicians or even the government. But this is not true, because it is not at the end of the day the individual politician or the leader of the government will receive their messages, but institutions. And they will not really be listened and they cannot really formulate their requests when they do not go via political parties. On the other hand, I think politicians lose a lot of time with permanently communicating on anything. And I think this is also not very helpful and very healthy. Of course, in nowadays, political decisions must be communicated, must be justified in other ways than in earlier times. This is a positive process, but this permanent form of communication is more blah blah, I would say, without content. And though I think it would be good for politicians to sit down and to think a little bit more what they are doing and what they are tweeting or communicating. So I think less would be more, probably for most of politicians. So it could also be a clever form of communication to be not on tweet or 24/7 or so.
When it comes to the political legitimacy or of democracy, we saw that in the last decade, political parties lost a lot of members. What are the reasons for this? On the one side, the younger population probably involves more in social movements, in civil society organization, which have a concrete issue like Friday for Future, the climate policy, etc. Why are political parties not so attractive for the young generation? And what could political parties do to increase their attractiveness to the younger generation?
Well, it's true, parties are losing members everywhere. Very difficult for political parties to mobilize new people. However, we have to see that also other forms of social organizations like trade unions, like sports clubs, like churches, and so many organizations are losing members. This has to do with the such-called individualization process in our days. We see that on the other side there are some social movements which have the possibility to mobilize, at least for a certain period of time, young people, but it is not guaranteed that these social movements are able to link followers for a long time. So we can also see that Fridays for Future is successful in some areas and some countries, but we have also a high level of fluctuation. So many people, when they have time as students or school or universities, they are engaged in this movement, but later drop out. So it is nowadays very difficult for organizations to have a continued support of followers. Nevertheless, we can see, especially in the example of Fridays for Future and other, there's a high level of interest by many people to be engaged in social affairs. And so I think political parties must invest more ideas, more creativity to attract young people. I think it is possible. There are still a lot of young people engaged in political parties, but parties has to offer possibilities of real participation in decisions, or to be candidate for public jobs at the local or regional or national level. And then I think parties continue to be attractive for youngsters. There is no possibility to engage people, but you have to invest and have to be more creative to attract young people.
And many parties, probably young people, have the feeling it is difficult to find ways to enter the parties because they seem to be closed-door institutions, closed-door organizations which have a kind of a club structure where people work together for decades and where it is sometimes difficult for newcomers or outsiders to find their place. Could you give maybe some recommendations to parties? How could they open up and be more directly engaged with non-members as well?
There are experiences. I repeat, young people want to be politically active. They are interested, and parties have to be creative. So they have to find new forms, for instance, of cooperation with these social movements, or these citizens platforms or other forms. At the local level, it is of course easy. At the local level, we have a lot of social events and groupings, and though parties have to be present also in this regard, and parties have to show that they are not closed. If they are doing internal things, they can invite people for certain kind of participation. Of course, it is difficult when it comes to the election of leaders, but there are so many other forms where parties can be attractive and can integrate non-party members in the party affairs. I think this is still a broad area to discover new forms to integrate people and to link with other social movements.
Thank you very much, Willi, for this very interesting insights and for sharing your experiences with the audience today. Feel free to look at our social media channels and to follow us, and we are very much looking forward to our next podcast. Thank you, Willi, for being with us today.
Thank you, Dennis.
With podcasts, we connect international experts and voices from the global south with policy and decision makers in Europe. We encourage and facilitate open dialogue on current global issues. At CUS MDPD, we design and implement multi-stakeholder dialogues, focusing on the nexus of democracy and governance, peace and security, and climate and energy. Thank you for tuning in to podcasts, Bridging Voices. Join our LinkedIn community, tag us in your tweets, and add us on Facebook, on SoundCloud, Spotify, and YouTube. Visit our website for our latest publications.